Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Mariska Zachariah, and I first want to thank you for being here today attending the Global XR Bootcamp, as well as watching my talk. I'm very excited to talk about how to effectively learn languages using virtual reality. So here's a breakdown of what I will discuss. I'm going to start off this presentation with a brief introduction about myself, followed by my career in virtual reality, teaching, tutoring, and language learning, and how that culminates into the following guidelines my team and myself use when designing a language learning VR game. As I mentioned previously, my name is Mariska Zachariah. As a non-binary person, I use they, them pronouns. I did my Bachelor's of Design at OCAD University in Toronto, Canada, majoring in a multidisciplinary art and code program called Digital Futures. While I was exploring physical computing, game design, and augmented reality, I did not work with VR during my bachelor's until I graduated. However, I did have a chance to experience the Oculus DK1 and many development kits that came around 2013 or 2014 onwards. I credit ITP Camp, a summer intensive program that I did at NYU, for gaining access on the Oculus DK2s and the Samsung Gear VRs. I should also mention that I have been using the Unity engine and studying my bachelor's which means I've been developing games and interactive content for almost 8 years. This made it easier to transition to VR and start making both interactive and passive works in this medium. The overall time I've worked both professionally and for personal and artistic projects in VR has been around 4 years, or over 4 years, working on VR games like, the upcoming Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe, which will be available on all consoles, and then specifically pertaining to VR, I worked on the Accounting Plus port by the same studio for the Oculus Quest. And additionally, I've done a lot of motion capture VR projects that were showcased at CES and South by Southwest. As you can see below, that's actually Martin Cooper, the inventor of the cell phone, checking out one of the experiences I was the main developer for at CES in 2017. So where does education, specifically language learning, come into the mix? Before we talk about both language learning and VR, how both language learning and VR intersected in my life and can therefore deliver you the title of this talk, I'm going to also talk about my history with working in education and my history with language learning. So before, during, and even after my university years, I was always teaching, tutoring children in math, English, and game design at both Kumon and for nonprofits like James Making Games and the Handai Society. Respectively, I've also given workshops at ITP Camp. While not pertaining to language learning per se, it gave me the initial insight as to how to structure both lessons and discover how effectively people learn, ranging from children to adults. Language learning has always been an interesting case for me. From having parents speaking multiple languages in India, including some Eurocentric ones like English and Portuguese, they chose to speak English with me, especially with the pressure of immigration and having to avoid putting my sister and myself through ESL, or English as a second language. Since we grew up in Canada, the opportunity arose, both by law and government-funded programs, to learn French since the ages of 5 years old, and then taking more intensive classes at 10 years old. While I am not fluent in the language, I am at the equivalent of a B1 level. Since 2019, I have been living in Berlin. And while there's the truth and just part about Berlin being a German city where you get to get by in the city without speaking German, it is still a place where I plan on residing for some time. And besides being the official language of the country, it expands your social circles as well as navigating the many cultural nuances of the country, and sometimes more specifically, the city itself. Now, how does this all tie in together? The culmination of my experiences took me to a unique position in the industry, being a VR developer for a language learning company called Chatterbug. To give some context about Chatterbug, this is a premium online language learning application, both online as well as on Android and iPhone. What sets it apart is how you progress with lessons, following a structure similar to a language learning school, with the the levels further broken down to units that really focus on what you want to learn when starting a new language. What sets apart Chatterbug from many other platforms is the availability of the tutors at any time and at any day of the week for 45-minute one-on-one lessons going through specific exercises focusing on a culmination of pronunciation, grammar, and vocabulary, with additional input depending on the topics covered by the tutor. Learning one-on-one can be quite intimidating at first, as I am one who definitely felt that the first time doing that, but I can attest how great the sessions are, on top of the various vocabulary, video, and writing exercises our language experience team produces. And so this is kind of an example of what we have, especially what's on basically the top screen or the top image, where you have an exercise with, I guess, the tutor and yourself on the call. And then we also do, what's up content, which I'll kind of delve into further. One of the great things about Chatterbug is their willingness to explore numerous avenues of how people want to learn. We recently started a WhatsApp service for language learning, where people who don't feel as confident going on video, who do not have great internet for video calls, or only have mobile access, can learn solely through WhatsApp by sending text and voice recordings that tutors can correct. As you may have guessed, Chatterbug is also interested in how VR can be used to learn languages, especially since the Oculus Quest released last year. Like many other users, they discovered how mundane tasks in real life translated into engaging play, and found it to be an interesting way to get a whole new audience introduced to learning languages in a VR setting. And this is where I come in, as does the rest of our team, consisting of designers, programmers, and artists to create a language learning VR application. So, okay. Learning languages through digital media isn't new. While it started with movies and TV, many people also learned English through playing video games. While localization existed for more commercial video games, some languages were not available in that region, and in some cases, many people seek for the original translation. I felt this growing up and playing video games, or even consuming a lot of things, I guess, in Japanese, whether in anime or video games, and realized how much I prefer hearing the original audio. And in my team's case, we have an additional challenge. Oh, sorry. Oh, apologies for that. In my team's case, we have an additional challenge. While educational VR games exist, alongside many simulations for numerous job industries, we're one of the few working with a team of linguists to work on having people learn languages in VR, while having fun at the same time, or playing or interacting with a virtual environment and story. With that said, I'm going to break down a few of the effective tools and tips used to incorporating language learning in virtual reality. So tip number one, thinking about everyday tasks and interactions when looking into language learning in VR. So this is something I reiterated previously when I mentioned why Chatterbug is interested in using VR. To find more users like in another field about our app, or to find another demographic per se. While I mentioned job simulator as an example to mundane tasks made interesting, one of the best tips I received to improve and maintain the new language you're learning is before going to bed, or sometime during the day when you're cooking and cleaning, you take note of the environment and think to yourself or out loud what each item is in that language, what you're interacting with, what you're going to cook tonight, and what you're going to watch tonight, all in that language. This exercises your brain into reviewing and memorizing words of things you use or do in your everyday life, and you feel more integrated in that language using your own space. Further to that point, there are specific scenarios where you want to learn a specific language. Say when you're going to a restaurant, a grocery store, or a doctor, and knowing what to say is important. VR succeeds in this simulation that takes mundane tasks, especially on a flat screen, but the immersion places the player in a scenario where you can prepare for things to review beforehand without the anxiety of doing so immediately in front of someone. Here you can see an order happening at a restaurant, or ordering food in the supermarket from one of our Chatterbug characters, um, Julie the hen, which I realize I don't have an example of. I apologize. But so well, in terms of what I show above, these are just more of the existing examples where to the left is a game that I was working on, which is Accounting Plus. Granted, it's a little bit different in terms of the actual gameplay, where it's maybe not that seemingly of a mundane task as there's a lot going on, but a lot of the interactions are just simply picking up and dropping things, and as you can see, you start in an office. And then Job Simulator is, again, I think the perfect example of that, where many people are just took to the liking of suddenly working in an office and working in a restaurant or in a fast food place, and yet the interactions were a lot of fun. Like in terms of VR, I feel like there's a lot of things you can keep really simple as long as, I mean, it's in a virtual environment, so you can sort of alter things, of course, however you want, but then you really take in your environment and see what you can interact with, and that's definitely a good mindset for language learning as well. All right. So yeah, tip number 2, this is more on the development side, which is having a debug language. So this is where I start to get more in the design and programmer state of mind. But this is important when working with a team of linguists or want to compare how effective if you want to just compare how effective your VR app is in language learning. So in our case, our application has 4 languages available: English, French, Spanish, and German. And in our case, since my team is either fluent or even somewhat knowledgeable in one of those languages, we realized that in order to find out how effective learning the language is, we have a couple of debug languages when testing, so you can actually gauge how effective your experience is and how well you have learned the vocabulary in those sessions. So speaking of those sessions, so consider that during most sessions, the most amount of words a person can learn in a day is 10 words. And this was advised by one of our linguists in my company, who also tests at our work as we were finding the best way to determine our sessions. And to put into context, we initially had it set up as an endless run, but testers found it extremely exhausting when the words became either too repetitive or they weren't even sure when to really stop or finish while playing. So in the newest version of our current game, players work as a chef on board a spaceship, taking various orders on board. And yeah, so there's a few guidelines we stick with here, which I'll talk about later too. So we specifically use something in like the A1 category for language learning, which is very simple words. This is usually units that involve introducing yourself, usually some food related items, colors, but a lot of it is actually more in terms of introduction to yourself. And yeah, I guess the food portion, if you ever want to order something or get something at a grocery store, etc. So this is how we set it up. But a lot of the ways we, I guess, contain it is within these rounds or sessions. And then we just have, about 10 words at a time. And with each round, so this is, I guess, in this way we set it up. When you see the word like the serviette, which is a napkin, you would maybe encounter that like 2 or 3 times per round. So we try and get the user to at least get something correct 3 times. And with that, then we kind of place it in more of like this memorized category. We kind of have these sets of like cards, I guess, if that makes any sense. And this will be something talked about later as well with language learning in VR. and how we incorporate that. But one of the ways is definitely not overwhelming the user with A, like just bombarding them with so many words, and B, assuming, so our sessions with 10 words, if they do 10 orders correctly, for instance, would take around, I would say, 2 to 5 minutes max, depending on the speed, but definitely on an average between 2 to 5 minutes. And so with, say, maybe even 100 rounds, or maybe not 100 rounds, but at least say 30 rounds, that would actually take either 40 minutes to an hour. And then with that in mind, within even that one session, I would say the amount of words just within one playthrough of a headset would be around, I would still put it to 10. Like, even though you might be bombarded with 20 plus words, there are, I think, some words, for instance, which wouldn't immediately come to your head unless you go through more than one, I guess, playthrough per day. But yeah, this is still something important to keep in mind, and something which I'll also talk about, which is, yeah, the tracking, progress, and milestones. So there's two things going on here. So one thing I mentioned is definitely you want to make sure for the user or for the player that you get to see that progress tracked. And you definitely want to visualize that, because that was the initial issue my team was coming up with, which was trying to see how to kind of sort of end around or make it seem like the player was progressing in some way, as opposed to just this constant maybe memorization of stuff. Granted, that was still our prototype side, but it's definitely very important to think about how we can even show the player like this is good. Like you're definitely learning, and you're even giving like a rating for each word. So we're still actually in a brief mock-up of this, but I think these are just a couple examples you can think of, like which words maybe are easy and or a little harder, like 1.1, like A 1.1 or A 1.2, 1.3. So we actually, so how our app does it, which I don't show here, but I can briefly describe, is we show like which words you just learned, and if you need to review some words, which words you need to review more. And I find that as an end of round screen, and even on our app, both on our app and VR, it's important for the users to really gauge where they are sitting at, like in the round or even over time, which words they're struggling with. And kind of like both Duolingo and probably Babbel and our application as well, you'll see these words kind of slowly come up. Like the ones you're struggling with, they'll come towards the end or somewhere in the middle of your session in a way. So this also happens with our game, and then this definitely ties into just how you can track progress. And even in the game sense, these are some things which I haven't written here, but just some things like having a mini boss per se, like really giving that sort of another like visual progress. And the other thing we can do, since there's like different words and therefore different categories, say there's like silverware, fruits, vegetables, and even frozen fruit, like frozen items that you keep in a fridge, like meat and dairy. We have it tracked so that you would go into like really easy stuff. We put fruit and vegetables in the easier categories for foods to learn, and then you unlock more items. And even though it sounds something that's more of like a free to play element, but really it's more just kind of enticing the user to see, oh, there's more things that I can unlock. And but more in the sense of giving that air of mystery of, hey, there's this thing that has maybe a padlock. And in our case with the galley, when you start getting promoted, you start to have more access to these things, and that's another way of visualizing progress as well. Oh yeah, so going back to the sessions again, since it's still important to think of that with language learning, is definitely timing those sessions. So unfortunately, as I kind of mentioned with the timing and how the feature isn't available for developers yet, this is unfortunately just something that I wish Oculus would provide, but they don't. And so this is just something based on my own, like our team's personal data, and many of the testers and just many people I've spoken to own an Oculus Quest. And sorry, to keep in mind, this is the primary device that we are releasing for, but we're also releasing for all the other headsets as well, including the Vive and the other Oculus. So, yeah, based on testers, both old and new, and veteran users, yeah, the average time for the Quest is usually around 20 minutes to an hour. And even though the photo shows something else completely, it's a different headset entirely. Actually, I think it's the DK2, but anyway, so another issue with the Oculus Quest, both, and I would say I speak definitely, I would say as a veteran user, but also for many others, and regardless of gender, even, is that there is a discomfort you feel after a while. Unlike, say, the more expensive headsets, in a way, you're paying for more kind of more comfort in a way, or better designed headset. Excuse me. So with that said, even though you can get sort of these additional peripherals for stuff, I would still put it an average between 20 to 40 minutes. I've gone as far as an hour or almost over an hour, but even at the 45-minute mark, the headset does get uncomfortable. So I know a lot of people, and especially because this is something that Oculus kind of looks for, is the value of play and like how long it will take, like how long the user will spend in a game. Like it's obviously like they want to get more people engaged in the game and not just like pick it up when done. Still think about, like as we said, like think about it in sessions. Like even with language learning, you don't progress within a few hours. You progress within like a few months, in a few years even. And so you granted, even though the headsets will obviously update in a few years, I think it's still really important to keep in mind that you don't want to think, even if you want to do like a very complete game, like definitely set checkpoints in a way, or boundaries, so these sessions feel, at least you could do it, maybe not 10 minutes, but definitely like if you want to aim for 20, 10 to 20, I think is this really good like goal. And I would say, as I mentioned before, our mini rounds would be around, like I'd say I'll put it to like 3 to 5 minutes or 2 to 5 minutes, two if you're really, really fast and know the game in a way. And then usually people want to do about 10 rounds. Like I would say, compared to how you would learn a language online, you end up spending around 20 to 30 minutes. And that's kind of this timeline we're aiming for as well. And yeah, so the next tip I'm on is taking inspiration from other existing language-based games. So this is actually one of the earlier prototypes, but this is still something where I think is a perfect example of this. So I I've played, I guess, various language games. Scribblenauts was, I guess, one I've taken inspiration from, at least especially in this case. But there's also a bunch of writing games and math games I used to do. If anyone remembers Math Circus, is a definite one. But and more in the specific to language learning stuff, I think Scribblenauts is a very interesting one. And I was inspired by how, in a way, yeah, you could like write in that case, because it was a flat screen, it was on the DS, you would just write anything or use letters to solve different puzzles. And I was inspired by that with how to use that in VR in a way, because even though you can take an inspiration from something, you don't necessarily have to do an exact, I guess, translation of the game. So I was inspired by thinking of a way, especially this was something that our linguists in our company, Chatterbug, wanted, which was how to teach verbs. And that's still a very interesting one, because it's really easy to think about vocabulary with like kind of matching items or picking items, or as we call them, pick and place in a way. Verbs was an interesting one because it's like, well, how do you teach verbs? And I immediately thought of something like Scribblenauts, where you want to, in this case, I used one of the variations of the characters of Chatterbug, which was our llama, Maria Dolores. And in this case, you want to say, or want to complete the sentence, the llama crosses the bridge. And it's hard to a bit see here, but there's different kind of blocks of letters. And then as you go through each one, you kind of hover through each one, you get to see which object it is. And especially in an A1 level, you kind of get this mindset of like, oh, it could be this item or that item. And in this case, I use the correct one. So this is like how to say the llama crosses the bridge in German. And then you kind of place it there, and then the llama gets to cross the bridge. And yeah, even I'd say there's other games I was inspired by, like even something like Monument Valley. I liked this kind of, or even sometimes like a dollhouse in a way. Like I was inspired by this kind of modular world or Polly Pocket. So it's oh, and there's another VR game, but it's escaping me, where you can also turn things around, like you kind of play as this god mode, and this is how you are, like a very like giant like character. You've got this miniature world, and in a way you can complete puzzles with it. And in this case, it's completing sentences or learning how to conjugate verbs. And yeah, so this kind of ties back into the point that there's so much inspiration to take of from games, and I feel like everyone knows this at this point. So um, yeah, still something to definitely reiterate, especially because I feel like VR is something that we still are exploring, honestly. I would say the Quest is one of the first few that, even though VR has existed for a long time, at least for a few years anyway, that the Quest has definitely introduced a whole new like array of players, and this is a way to like keep exploring and keep collaborating. And in um, my team's case, it's with linguists. And this might not apply to everyone, but I thought I would mention it when considering multiplayer. So this is something we discovered, especially, or not discovered, but was really prototyping in the past. And this is kind of actually pertaining to the store clerks, I was briefly talking about earlier. So the single player would have our Chatterbug characters or NPCs, and that's where I mentioned Julie the hen. But in this case, I forgot to show it, but this is the multiplayer version of that. And that is having around 5 people. And so 2 people, so one person was the store, yeah, the store clerk who was more, like, was, I guess, kind of needing to learn how to comprehend the orders as they kept going. And then one person was the cashier, or not cashier, one person was the customer. And they're the ones having to learn, just having photos of the items or icons, as you can see in the shopping list in that screenshot, is they would have to remember, okay, what is the word of tomato in Spanish or French or German? And then have to ask that. And then the other person, the cashier, would have to actually understand this. And then we decide to have a round where, besides these 2 people, we can have 3 people watch. And it was initially just to see what our test, like to show people as a demo. But then we realized that this was very interesting to get an audience who can just kind of spectate, almost like a let's play in a way, but almost even more interactive, because you're in the scene. You can also talk through the microphone if you wanted to. And in some cases, either you'd be passively watching, or you could even give advice and help out either the cashier or the customer. I thought that was very interesting, and as well as a social aspect. And in a way, like a grocery store, you'd have a lot of people around. You can still talk to whoever you wanted to. So I thought that was still a very interesting way to kind of bring something in a mundane experience, but also add a multiplayer twist to it. And yeah, but in terms of also taking into consideration how the tutor can be involved passively, so in this case, I don't show it here, but we were also thinking of also going back to an earlier point or an earlier tip about thinking about the time consumed in VR, especially if you're going to have something like a tutor and whoever is learning or the student. You have to think about the tutor for sure. We initially thought about this having like the tutor and the student in this experience, but then we realized, well, a tutor can't be in VR, say, for like 5 hours of a working day, or 5+ hours even. That's a lot of work. Even if the sessions aren't maybe around the 5 hours, it does get exhausting. So it's always good to also think about sort of this cross-platform element. And in this case, we would have the tutor as the cashier, and so the player would be, or the player slash the student would definitely be the customer in this case, and then still learning language by learning what the items are and getting tips from the tutor, who would be the cashier. And who knows, like you could still have spectators. And a huge thing point, which I forgot to mention, is having the ability, sorry, having the ability to switch roles is was another thing of importance as well, so that you can kind of go through each session. So say if you're an audience member and you just want to stand back, and then you feel, oh god, you feel like you're ready. Excuse me. You feel that you're ready to take on the role of either cashier or customer, then you're free to switch after a round or so. And so I'll run by, I've got 10 minutes left. Immersing the environment with details where the language is implemented and users can take notes of words. So I thought this was really important because I thought about it a lot in even some like game talks at GDC, or the Game Developers Conference. And in this case, it would be with language learning. Granted, there's definitely sometimes issues with like how we still work with UI and VR. But I thought even with the small details of how you immerse a player is still important. So I'll go by a couple examples. So one of the interesting ones, which I was inspired by, was um, you kind of using like a subway conversation or a metro for giving a way of like how people kind of, you can just overhear people speaking. And then this would be kind of more of this passive listening exercise with a bit of a quiz. And you even have this recorder if you wanted to repeat the conversation or repeat or pause after the conversation is played. So with that element in mind, I still thought, well, in a subway, you still take a lot of your environment. And I'm always interested the minute I step off in any country, especially with a different language, I always look at the ads and I find it's a very interesting way to even get or learn certain words or certain slangs as well, or certain colloquialisms. And I think this, at least in like scenes like this, when you think about an environment that you're creating, like always think about the little details of that. And granted, as you can see, it's very much a prototype, but it's really highlighting, say, the ads in the scene. And then, yeah, even with the, I mean, the mainstay is the conversation, but even where you see the clipboard, just above you is a speaker, and the speaker would actually have announcements as well. So we would try not to bombard the user with too many things, but it would actually go in sort of turns. So you could passively just read the ads, and then after you hear the conversation, and even actually answer the question, you would start hearing the announcements and then kind of act as a transitory period. And additionally, you'd see doors open, and then you could even see ads there or the station and stuff, and learn different things that way and like really take in more of that. And in this case, so say with our kitchen game, or as we call it, the galley game, we have things like labels in the containers, and that's also important as well, or sorry, the drawer. And things like that, like whatever even that you see in a kitchen or an environment, labels are one thing, but like for instance, you learn, I mean, it's quite easy here because it's quite similar to English, is like alcohol or alcoholic free drinks, teller, which is like the plates, bestek, which is cutlery. So even then, like I'm slowly learning things, but granted, I've been learning for a few months now. But you really start just taking in more and more. In this case, it's like, okay, well, what item do I want? And even if you don't know the words per se, you start to kind of grasp as you turn the knob and then discover, oh, servietten means napkins, or this is that. And this is, I think, very important to still consider when you're designing a language learning game and still want to be immersed in something, is really, yeah, think about all these little details to reiterate that. Yeah, and then don't forget audio, as I mentioned. Oh, God, speaking of audio, my voice. I do apologize for this. I'm not used to speaking for this long in a long time. Of course, there are audio files and sound files that can be repeated. And so I mentioned this when it comes to audio, is thinking about pronunciation, and then voice to text. So in one case, especially when you're working with how to pronounce things or pronunciation, we were using Google services. So in this case, you would have like a word and then you just repeat it, and it was a simple exercise. And then an interesting challenge we wanted to go through is kind of thinking of an offline option for this. So we gave the option where users can record themselves pronouncing the word and then comparing it to the original audio, and then determining how correct their pronunciation was. And this is also very interesting because then it doesn't have to, again, going through kind of accessibility in a way, if whoever maybe not have immediate access to Wi-Fi can still use this offline version. And even though, I guess, for instance, some people could cheat with that, I believe that most people would still want to see sort of a comparison of, okay, this is how you actually pronounce it, and then this is how I pronounce it, and then you can really compare the two and then kind of gauge where you are at. So if anything, it could also just be a practice round. You don't have to, you can connect to Wi-Fi to do the actual test, for instance, or say a boss round. But it's still important to have that mindset of, at least with language learning, while a lot of it is obviously reading and writing and just kind of, and I guess also listening comprehension in a way, is just speaking it as well is still very important. And I mean, that's for all of us, at least. When you want to learn a language or want to progress, especially with certifications, this is definitely the way to go. And then remember, it's still got to be enjoyable, and this can be really tricky to balance. And this is actually something that is still even a bit a work in progress for my team and myself, but it's something, even discussing or collaborating with our linguists and our team, is we can't give like a whole educational unit. If you want to, and if that's possible, that's still something that you would need to refute, for instance. So, for instance, with our app, as I mentioned, we actually do, so besides going through like A1, B1, B2, etc., we actually give certifications out for that. And in this case, for our game, we didn't want to really stress that. We thought we could give a sort of outline of A1, or even think of like maybe 70% of the words with A1. But the whole point is just to really get people thinking about, hey, I realize I can learn languages with VR, and then kind of introduce them to the app or Chatterbug. And if they see these characters, maybe even kind of acting in real life as opposed to just kind of on the screen or in the app, that also gauges interest in a way. Because as I mentioned, you don't necessarily need to create the next Beat Saber. Be realistic about how you can teach someone in VR. Given the other factors I mentioned previously, especially to the average amount of time someone can spend on a headset per week. And still think about, just having, like, are you enjoying yourself? Because that's still a kind of balance you really need to strike. It's like, while I'm learning this language, is it still fun? And always think about that, at least for a language learning VR game that you're either designing or consuming. That's definitely the way to effectively show, like, is this a worth it thing, a worth experience that will definitely inspire you to keep going back to it as well. So you don't want something that is too redundant at the same time. So I hope that some of these tips that I have learned from working on this experience, and that you take away is useful when developing a language for language learning games. If you are considering making VR or XR content for educational or specifically linguistic-based content, I hope that both these tips and other collaborations you think about with either linguists or other developers, and even just figuring out a way to go through online content, will serve you when you consider XR as well. So thank you again for attending my talk.
Hello, Marisha. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Hello.
I can. Can you hear
Good.
me?
mute something. Otherwise, I hear myself double, and that's driving me insane. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, so hello again. Yeah, that was a very interesting talk. I'm very big. I love education, to use this kind of devices for education. I do that myself. Although on a completely other level than yours. I really love the spaceship chef. That was really fun. And the llama. I was like that really playful. Yeah. I'm a kind of a science fiction lover myself, and the idea of walking around on, well, a kind of enterprise around that is really funny. I was wondering what devices you actually have found are the most usable, because you mentioned quite a lot, but I wonder which you find has the biggest success rate in your line of education.
So I would go based around what the consumers are really interested in and what the sales are as well in this case. And I use that as like maybe the most. So I think about the accessible point of where VR is, because yeah, in the past I've worked especially with the Vive and the older Oculus Rift or the Rift S. But I think an issue was like the most amount of people that would go through an experience with those headsets would usually be in the trade shows I was at or conferences or other game festivals. Whereas I noticed with the Quest, even in the previous games I've worked on that were ported for the Oculus Quest, all the sales pretty much caught up with all the other headsets, which was really fascinating. So I find if you can, like, definitely look for any developer who really wants to go, especially more on the commercial side, definitely look into the Quest first. And you don't necessarily have to publish to the store, because I forgot to mention this, but there's other avenues like SideQuest as well.
Mm-hmm.
So anyone that wants to, even like, for instance, if we, like both in companies, like I've seen other companies do this too. It doesn't have to be like your own personal thing, but definitely people, if you want to try out something there or show a demo, that's definitely a great avenue to place it as well.
Okay, we have a question from Stephanie Favier. I will show it here, and she asks, have you considered to have a diagram to compare the right audio pronunciation to end user pronunciation?
So that's a good question. So when we initially demoed it, I didn't have the best screenshot for it, but we did initially have the word itself. So I don't know if that's necessarily a diagram, but if you mean how, I don't know what the exact term is, but the actual pronunciation of like how, I guess they kind of show it in a certain, like how it's pronounced by an accent, I guess. So we haven't tried that. But that would be curious to try, because that's another great way. Because yeah, as I mentioned, the big challenge was if someone doesn't have access to the internet, how can they still continue this? And that's definitely one way of showing it, or even having pictures. But I guess the issue is that not everyone is coming from a native English speaker background. So how one would think about pronouncing it from an English native tongue, it would be different if someone has a Spanish native tongue learning German. So that's another interesting challenge we're thinking of. But I think maybe having like how Wikipedia or any dictionary has that pronunciation kind of tablet might be helpful, or the symbols for that. I forget the exact term, but you've seen it in dictionaries and probably Wikipedia. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Stephanie, for this great question. Okay. Now I wonder, I'm more into AR than VR. Are you actually considering those things as well? I mean, learning is not restricted, especially language learning, not restricted to people basically having access to, well, rather expensive devices. Not that, I mean, I have here an Android phone that's like 300 euros and it does AR. Have you considered doing that, or do you see all kinds of practical problems with that?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I didn't mean for the interruption. So for that, I would say it is quite effective. I wouldn't say my company, it would be interesting if Chatterbug does look into that. I will say, while we're not, I would definitely say it's great to look at AR. I used to use especially the Vivoria toolkit because I worked with Unity. And I always liked this aspect. And even with other people that I follow on Twitter. There's a user that goes by Push Matrix, and he does interesting things as well with how, I mean, kind of using AR, but with Shopify. And I always pictured ways where you can kind of like look at objects or scan objects, and then you'd get translations for that. Like, I can't wait till Google gets to that level, because right now it's words and text, and I use that all the time now that I'm Canadian living in Germany. But I would definitely say that that would be a great feature as like an AR tool that I can think of with language learning as well. Because sometimes you just want to use your phone and be like, okay, but what's that object again, or something like besides text? You want to use like maybe a photo as well. So I would say that would be a great avenue with AR and language learning as well.
Well, I didn't know you're Canadian. I have a soft spot for Canadians. The most
Oh.
Dutch, most Dutch people are. That has to do with the Second World War. The Canadians were actually the people who kicked out the Nazis here. So kudos to you.
Thanks, and kudos to them.
Yeah,
as
exactly.
Well,
I was also wondering, like for controlling stuff, have you find, because you're using different kind of headsets, have you found, because of the ongoing discussion in the world, do you prefer the use of controllers, or do you actually think the hand tracking actually works better? What's your vision about that?
Ooh. So this is actually a discussion that my team and I have all the time. And initially, it's funny, we were just kind of exploring the hand tracking side, and I do feel it still slowly does need work, but I've noticed, and besides like us as developers who've worked with headsets, like we know the controllers, but we noticed in order to get more people on board, like especially with other testers, and when we've been testing it internally with our company, a lot of people really enjoy, like once the hand tracking works, it's like, oh, this feels way more natural. And it's a weird thing because it feels like it's a bit of a waiting game. Because right now we're trying to figure out, like right now we use like a lot of just grabbing and picking up things, and voice if we can. So it's really trying to keep it simple. And I always think about that, at least with VR especially. But I will say, as hand tracking is getting improved over time, as Oculus removes it from beta, I think it is, but as it gets improved over time, we're definitely looking for like more into just using gestures. Because another instance is like if you're going through conversations, or if you're going through like maybe a cutscene, you want to like fast forward something, we're thinking of like, okay, let's stick to gestures as opposed to like having to teach someone all these controls, because that's still a big thing now is tutorials. And I think once gestures come into play, it'll be very natural. So I'm excited when I'm more, I guess, as it keeps developing team, hand gestures. Possible.
Yeah, the problem is always well, I have a control. Oh, it's like a controller here. It has like these multiple things of buttons, and when you give this to an average user, it's like, what?
Yes. I've definitely been there.
Yeah. I can imagine that. So that's very, very interesting. Let me see. I have another question. Where is it? There. I maybe have missed this. I think I heard you talk about it, but it went a little bit too fast for me. What markets are you exactly targeting? Which language?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's a good question. So I earned like the initial, like from the company, the goal was like knowing the VR market now, because initially we're aiming for all headsets, but let's use the Quest as an example. It's a consumer, and I guess it might have increased. Like before, I feel like there are a lot of VR enthusiasts that are just getting all the headsets or dev kits, but now it's way more on the mainstream side. I mean, I'm one of those as well. But yeah, I find it's like a lot of families and users, and a lot of people think of it primarily as a gaming device. And that, I mean, I have to see, I think there's way more things you can do, especially with VR chat. Like, I think it's both social people as well as, social and gaming people. And it's interesting with the pandemic as well, like how much that's also increased, especially on the social VR side as well.
Yes, sure.
And yeah. And with that in mind, like also why I kind of briefly touched on multiplayer, like this was actually something inspired around the pandemic, where it's like, okay, how do we get other people like on board, and like how would you work with, like when we were doing that kind of supermarket scene, it's like, well, there's always other people. It's not just like you and the store clerk. It's maybe other people that you want to maybe overhear a conversation for, or like observe or get help almost having, like, we initially tested it more as like a passive audience with the two people, and then you could switch roles anytime or at any round. And that was something we were thinking around that for. So that market is definitely a little more in the people who are into gaming for sure. So we want to add that, make sure it's still fun in a way, but definitely having like people who also realize that it's like, oh, let me learn languages that way. Because obviously when people like sign up for, say, Duolingo or something like that, it's like you know what you want, but it's more like, hey, like, let's entice, like, have this game element, but also really like it's educational, and maybe that'll entice players to also look into the app and like take it more seriously, which is also why we stick with A1, because we want it to be approachable as well, like, and not extremely difficult in the educational sense. Like, maybe for a game we'll have a challenge, but we don't want to bombard a player with like a whole unit of sorts in a way. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually have lots more questions, but looking at the clock, I have to wrap this up. I want to thank you very much for this very great presentation, for your time and being there. And I hope you will enjoy the rest of the conversation here. Thank you very much on behalf of the community. Bye-bye.
Thank you. All right, I bailed Discord. Bye.
Yeah.
If anyone has questions, I mean, I can answer there. Yeah. All right.
Okay, thank you.
Bye, everyone.